I'm Jackie Estrada. I've been involved as a comics fan since I was a child. I grew up in the 50s when everybody read comics, and I read things like Katie Keene and Walt Disney comics and stories, and I did see some Superman and stuff like that, but it was mostly humor things. And then as I got a little older, I was a big fan of Mad Magazine, and I had to get my Mad Magazine every week. And when I was in high school, I even wrote for the school paper and tried to write in the style of Mad Magazine. So that's how far back I go. In the 50s, everybody was part of pop culture. You watched TV shows, you read comics, you read magazines, you read science fiction, fantasy. I read all of that stuff. I went to the library and checked out every science fiction book and fantasy book that was geared to younger audience, and then I moved up and read all of the ones that were geared to, on the adult bookshelves in the main part of the library. I was just voracious about reading anything, and it was not something different or separate from regular life. You played sports out in the street, and you went to school, and you read comics, and you watched TV, and went to the movies on Saturday. That was all part of just daily life. I didn't really collect comics. I didn't get into collecting comics until I got out of high school and was in college. And in high school, I met a guy named Davey Estrada, who was in the high school band with me in Chula Vista, California. And he was another person who liked a lot of the same books and things I did. He liked the same music, so we eventually, after we went to college together, we got married after college. But during the 60s, when we were going to San Diego State, we became collectors, and we would go every week, twice a week, to the newsstand and buy all the new comics that came out. And we made a trip every 6 months up to LA to go to Hollywood Boulevard, to go to the used bookstores and go to the stores that were starting to sell old comics, including a place called Cherokee Bookstore. And at Cherokee Bookstore is the first place I can think of that was really a comic book store. And we're talking, say, 1966. And there was a guy named Bert Bloom, who was the brother of the owner of Cherokee Bookstore, and he had a separate area up on the second floor of the bookstore that had it was a room filled with boxes of comics. And he sat behind a desk in there, and comics fans would come in and say, "Do you have anything from the Green Llama from 1942?" And he would see, and if he pulled it out, he would say, "Yeah, that's going to be $5." And people, "Oh, $5 for an old comic? I don't know." Of course, the comics that he sold for that price back then are worth hundreds and thousands of dollars today. But we would go to the back issue bins that had all the funny animal things, the Disney comics, the Little Lulus, the Carl Barks, Donald Duck comics, and they would be $0.25 each, 5 for $1. So we would come home with 100 comics from those bins and just read them and enjoy them. And at that time, we discovered that there were these things called fanzines that were fan magazines devoted to old comics. So we started subscribing to them, and these fanzines would kind of give us information on comics that we should look for, because, hey, you read a comic and you don't realize that somebody did that. There was an artist, there was a writer. Who was that? They never credited them. So these fanzines would tell you who did those comics. And then you'd start to look at them and say, "Oh yeah, I can tell the same artist did this comic as did that comic. Even though it's not signed, I can tell it's that same style." And so you'd start looking for them. And then there was a store downtown San Diego, and it was called Ye Olde Magazine Shoppy on Broadway. And they sold back issues of Marvel comics. Now, Marvel started publishing superhero comics in 1962 with Fantastic Four, and then 61 Fantastic Four, 62 they did Spider-Man, and started doing things like Iron Man and Doctor Strange, and all the titles that are the landmark Marvel titles that are having 50th anniversary this year. And we would go in there and say, do you have any Thor comics? And they would pull out a paper bag filled with Thor comics, and they were marked on the front 35 cents each. So we get a stack of Thor comics, and this was the way we caught up on what Marvel had been doing for the early part of the 60s, because we were doing this in like 65, 66. So then, we not only bought all the new stuff that came out in the newsstand each week, but we were filling in our holes from the old stuff. Well, in the 1960s, there were not just superhero things on the newsstand. There was Casper. There was a whole line called Charlton Comics. There were mystery comics and horror comics and things for kids. And we would just buy everything. And Davy Estrada was a collector who cataloged everything. He had everything on index cards. He had notebooks with lists of all the comics, which ones we had, which ones we didn't have, what condition they were in. I wasn't oriented toward that collector mentality. I just like to read them and enjoy them. And to this day, my old comics are in a closet in my kitchen that I just call Jackie's Comics Closet, and they're not preserved with bags and boards. They're just in stacks, and I have all the original Mad comic books before it was a magazine. I have a lot of Golden Age, Silver Age comics, and they're just in piles in the closet. If I want to look something up, I look it up and say, oh yeah, that was a good story. But that was my first experience buying and collecting seriously related to comics. And again, the fan aspect of it was becoming involved in the fanzine community, in that I would occasionally write letters to the fanzines and subscribe to all of them. Well, in 1970 was the first Comic-Con, and I went to it. Davy Estrada did not go with me. I just was curious. It was downtown San Diego. I said, I'll just go pop in there for a day. It was more than a day show, but I only went the one day, and I saw Jack Kirby talk. I saw Ray Bradbury talk. I looked at the art display they had. They had approximately 300 people there. There was a little dealer's room, and I didn't know anybody. I got looked at strangely a lot because I was a woman in my early 20s, and most of the attendees were teenage guys. But in fact, one person kind of looked at me and said, are you looking for something? Because this is a comic convention here. So, but I really enjoyed it. So the next year, Davey and I both went, and we went for one day. And I went again in 72, I went in 73. And then I believe it was 74 that I was doing some freelance writing, and I wanted to write an article about Comic-Con. So I contacted some of the people involved, and eventually Shell Dorff, and he said, well, why don't you come to one of our meetings, because that'll help you know more information so that you can write your article. At the time, I had big ambitions. I was going to sell it to Rolling Stone magazine, and I had already had a go-ahead from an editor at Rolling Stone to write this article. But between the time that he gave me the go-ahead and when I went to write the article, they changed editors, and a new person says, why would we want to have anything about comics? So instead, I got sort of roped in to working, helping out a little bit on the PR for the show. And then I think it was in '75 that I got more actively involved. I helped edit the souvenir book. At one point, they had an art show this was when the convention was at the El Cortez Hotel, and one of the rooms was an art show, and Davey and I were just in there looking at the pieces, and the guy Shell Dorf saw us and said, nobody's manning the door here. Could you guys, I know I don't know you, but could you just kind of stand here and make sure nobody takes anything until Clayton Moore comes back, because he's the one supposed to be running this? And we said, okay. So in the meantime, we had run into science fiction author Theodore Sturgeon, and big fans of Sturgeon, and wanted to get his autograph, but we didn't have anything for him to sign. So Davey got the idea, well, would you just sign the back of my badge? And so Ted said, oh, sure. So he signed his name. Davey put the badge back in, but it said Ted Sturgeon on it instead of Davey Estrada. So when Clayton Moore came back and walked into this art show, he just looked at Davey's badge. Now, this was a short guy in his 20s. Theodore Sturgeon was in his 50s with a beard, but Clayton just says, oh, Mr. Sturgeon, I'm such a big fan of yours. And he kind of had to say, sorry, I'm not Theodore Sturgeon. But we both ended up working on the show starting in '75. Davey ended up working in the programming department. I was in the information department. I ended up helping with guests, bringing the guests to the show, and I've been working on the show ever since. Well, there's been so many, but like I say, in the '70s, I was working on the souvenir book, and up through the early '80s, including, I came up with the idea to do a theme. So we did a theme for the program book, the '60s, and we had all of the cartoonists send in their artwork with '60s related themes. And I did the program book also in '84, and then somebody else did it from '85 to '88, and I did it again in '89, and different years I did the program book. I was also the official photographer in the late '70s and early '80s. I was involved in setting up the blood drive. In 1976, Davey and I went to Kansas City for the World Science Fiction Convention. And one of the guests was Robert A. Heinlein, and he was our hero. And the whole reason we went to Kansas City was for Robert Heinlein. And he said he would not give autographs to anybody unless they donated blood, and that was his big cause. So I thought, well, if we had a blood drive in San Diego, maybe Heinlein would come and be a guest at Comic-Con. And we invited him to be a guest on the basis of having a blood drive, and he said yes. So he came in 1977, and we have had a blood drive ever since then. In the 1980s, I came up with the idea to have an artist's alley at Comic-Con because I saw artists sitting at tables in the lunch areas and finding empty spots wherever they could to sit and draw and try to sell their stuff. And I said, why don't we have a place for them to be and charge them a minimal amount so that they feel like they have their place at the show. And so Artist Alley's been around ever since then. I also started the pro registration department because for the first 16 years of Comic-Con, when the pros arrived, they stood in the same line as everybody else. They were attendees and they waited to get their badges and registration. And when I saw some of the older people in line waiting, I said, they should not have to do that. They should be able to have a spot. They go, they get their badge. And so we set up a special table and had professional registration, and so that's been in existence ever since then. And then in 1990, I was asked to be the administrator for the Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards, which is the Oscars of comics, and I've been doing that ever since. That's our big awards show that we now have on Friday night of Comic-Con. And I also have been continuing to work on publications. Everything was on a work-for-hire basis up until 2008 when I went on staff as a part-time person. Part of the time I work on the Eisner Awards, the other part I work on the events guide, which is the 180-page booklet that you get at the show that tells all the programs, where the exhibits are, has all the information on autograph signings and the various events going on at the show. So I put that together every year. I edit it and produce it. And I'm also chairman of the guest committee that decides who to invite to the show. So I have a lot of hats at Comic-Con. That we've had program books since the first year of Comic-Con. There's been different names for it: souvenir book, program book, but now it's two separate publications because we have a souvenir book that is a 4-color souvenir that has biographies of the guests and things that is given out to everyone. And then we have the events guide that has all of the events going on. But originally it was just a little booklet that had everything in it. It had the biographies of the guests, it had the schedule of events, and for the first con the schedule of events was 1 page. Now it's I think 14 programming rooms for 4 days going continuously, so it's very different than having one room with 4 or 5 programs in it a day. Everybody thought having an artist alley at Comic-Con was a great idea, and as long as somebody would take charge of it, that was me for the first couple of years. And that was a matter of just the artists would contact me saying they wanted space, and I would have to figure out, given the number of tables I had. I originally put 3 to 5 people at every table. I said, you don't want to sit at a table a whole convention, so share with, amongst yourself, decide who's going to be there at what times, and then you can just take turns, and there'll be 3 chairs. And that was the first couple of years, and then when I stopped doing it in '89, Clydeen Nee took over, and she has been the Artist Alley coordinator ever since. And today, the Artist Alley has something like 140 tables, where we started with 17, and each person gets their whole table for the whole show, but it is complimentary. There's no charge for Artist Alley space. Well, there's a weird history to the Eisner Awards in that originally there was something called the Jack Kirby Awards. And this was in the mid-1980s, and it was something that Fantagraphics Books came up with. And they are a publisher based in Seattle, and they do alternative and independent type books. And one of their employees, Dave Ulbrich, was the person they put in charge of these Jack Kirby Awards. And the idea was to have professionals in the comic book industry vote on a slate of nominees in categories like Best Writer and Best Single Issue and Best Comic Book and things like that. So Dave set that up, and there was voting was done by mail, and then they were announced at a program at Comic-Con. And that was done for a couple of years. And then in 1990, Dave sent out basically a nominating ballot where he included with it a list of what he thought was everything that was eligible. Because people had said, I can't look at a blank piece of paper for Best Writer and know what came out last year and what would qualify. And so if you gave me a list, then I would be able to say, oh yeah, that was great, I'm going to put that down. Well, the only problem was that the list he sent out was incomplete and people complained about it. So rather than start over. He just said, there's not going to be any Eisner Awards this year. And in fact, I have left Fantagraphics. I have a new job. Well, let me step back a little bit. In between the Kirby Awards and the Eisner Awards, when Dave Ulbrich left Fantagraphics and wanted to take the Kirby Awards with him. But Fantagraphics said, no, that's our awards, we just put you in charge of it. And so with the dispute over who was really had the name Jack Kirby Awards, Jack said, I don't want to be involved in the middle of this dispute, so let's not have a Jack Kirby Award. So then Fantagraphics said, okay, well, we're going to do Harvey Kurtzman Awards. We've talked to Harvey. Harvey is going to be lend his name to it. And Ulbrich talked to Will Eisner, and Will said, yes, I will attach my name if it's a nonprofit. And Ulbrich set up a nonprofit, and he had a board of advisors. And Will Eisner is definitely one of the preeminent people in the history of comics. He was there starting in the late 1930s, working on some of the very first comics that were produced, including things like Sheena, Queen of the Jungle and Black Hawk. But he also was an innovator in that he did something called the Spirit section, which was a comic book size insert to Sunday newspapers that featured his character, the Spirit, and then it had some backup stories as well. And he owned that. Now, it was unprecedented, really, during that time for any creators to own their characters. There's all kinds of famous situations of Siegel and Schuster selling the rights of Superman to DC. Bob Kane did make sure that he had ownership of Batman, or at least a type of ownership with DC, but mostly these were work-for-hire people. And Will saw, okay, I want to have something that's my own. So he did that. Then he went on to do the first graphic novel that really had any kind of public attention, which was came out in 1978. So he had a career that kind of went from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then from the late 70s on, he produced all kinds of graphic novels and is just an ambassador around the world for American comics. So it was wonderful to have his name attached to the awards. So then come 1990, where Dave's been doing the awards for a couple years and ends up having to bail on them. So at the 1990 Comic-Con, Will and his representative Dennis Kitchen and Dave Ulbrich wanted to have a meeting with Faye Desmond, who her title at the time was General Manager of Comic-Con. She's now Executive Director, and me, and they wanted to sit down and talk about what would be the future of the Eisner Awards. And they proposed that since it was a nonprofit that was doing the Eisners, that Comic-Con as a nonprofit would be a good home for the awards. And Will's choice was he wanted me to be the administrator. And I'm not sure how he came up with me. I had dealt with him a lot as far as when he was a guest for the show, making sure that he was treated well to come to the convention. But they did request me, and Comic-Con said, sure, we would love to have that as part of our mission statement of promoting the comic arts. So that's when Comic-Con took over the Eisners, and that's when I became the administrator of the Eisner Awards. Well, that was in, I think, 75 or 76. There was a organization that had a president, vice president, secretary, and various people in charge of departments, but it was all fan, all volunteer. And the vice president at the time, Richard Butner, was somebody who said, we really should be nonprofit, and we should incorporate as a nonprofit because that will get us better deals and treatments with hotels, with convention centers, with all kinds of aspects of running the show rather than just being a bunch of volunteers. And the thing is that it was volunteer up until 1984 was the first time there was even an employee. So everything was completely volunteer. There were no paid positions. In 1984, Faye Desmond was hired on a part-time basis to be the general manager, and a phone was put in her house to be the Comic-Con phone. So there wasn't even an office until, I think, another year later. But the incorporation thing, I think, was pretty much instigated by Richard Butner. Well, I mean, I can give you some statistics. The first convention had 300 people. The second one had about 800. The third one had 900 or so. The fourth one, which was in 1973, was when we hit 1,000. Then 1974, we doubled, more than doubled, to nearly 2,500. Part of that was because that's the one and only Comic-Con that was 6 days. It was July 31st through August 5th of that year, and we had some really famous people at the show. We had Charles Schultz. We had Milton Caniff. We had Frank Capra, the movie maker. We had Chuck Jones from animation. We had Walter Koenig from Star Trek. We just had such a stellar lineup of people that just everybody who'd been to the previous year's show raved about it, and then it just doubled. And it didn't have anything to do with incorporation. In 1975, it kind of held steady at the 2,500. 76, it went to 3,000. 77, 4,000. 78, 5,000. And 79, 6,000. So in the 70s, it went up about 1,000 a year toward the end of the 70s. But that was, people coming from all over the country to have fun in the summer in San Diego. Well, in 1980, we were actually in the convention center downtown San Diego, the old convention center on B Street. And then in 81, we were at the El Cortez, and then 82, all of the 80s was spent in the convention center. It's called CPAC, Convention and Performing Arts Center. And it started out, we were using just one part of it, and then we were using the exhibit hall, and then we were using the Civic Theater, and then we were using the other big hall. So it kept taking up more and more space. And we did start to get more celebrities during that period. Going back to the 70s, the 76 Comic-Con, there was the first presentation, as far as I know anywhere, about Star Wars. And people from Lucasfilm came and were talking about this movie that George Lucas was making that was going to be coming out in 77. And the Star Wars fandom definitely fed into the growth of Comic-Con, because Lucasfilm loved the reception they got in San Diego, and every year they would bring a program, they would bring the movies to show. We'd have long lines of people going to the screenings for Star Wars. So people who say, well, it was about comics back then. They didn't have all this movie stuff. Well, we did have movie stuff, and that's what brought people in, that added to the mix of comics, science fiction, fantasy, and film, which were the three things that were emphasized at the very first Comic-Con. And then in the 80s, we started getting exhibitors that came like from Ghostbusters and from other promotional things for movie studios. Were already starting in that period. Francis Ford Coppola, I think, came when he did the Dracula movie. So the movie tie-in stuff goes way back. Well, As far as diversity and gender and stuff like that, the attendees were, say, 70% male, 30% female for the first decade or so, but then it just started having more and more things that were appealing to female fans and families, and in the 80s more and more females were coming, and by now, I mean, it's everything and everybody. As far as the Comic-Con committee was concerned, it was, I'd say, practically 50-50 male and female. It was a lot of teenage girls who were interested in particularly fantasy and science fiction, Star Trek, things like that, got involved in putting on the show. A lot of people got involved in putting on the show that weren't particularly fans of anything. They just liked putting on the show. So there was somebody who was in charge of the hospitality room who's still in charge of the hospitality room, and I don't know if she's ever read a comic book. People get their niches and their capabilities, and that's what they do. And to me, that was always a thing I liked about the show, was that there was people of different ages, people of different genders, people of different ethnic backgrounds. They all had one thing in common, which was their not just love for pop culture, but for the show. The show became a way of life for them. We had somebody in 2007, Leah Hernandez, who was complaining that we didn't have enough female guests. Well, the interesting thing is that our guest committee, which is kind of half women and half guys, we come up with the people we want to invite, and we invite, we make a point of trying to have a very diverse guest list, and we invite a lot of female cartoonists, and a lot of them have other conflicting things they're doing, or for other reasons don't want to come to the show. So they were invited and they turned us down. So over the history of Comic-Con, you can look in any one of the souvenir books and look at the guest lists, and you will see just all kinds of female cartoonists and writers and things in here as the guests. So I've never considered that to be a problem of the show, because we actively encourage female creators. This book, Comic-Con 40 Years of Artists, Writers, Fans, and Friends, is something that we produced for our 40th anniversary in 2009, and I co-wrote the book, and I supplied a lot of the photos for it because I kept everything. So I'm just somebody who has been around long enough that I am kind of a resource of knowledge about certain aspects of the show, but I am only one element of the show. There are so many aspects to Comic-Con that I don't know about, I'm not involved in, and would rather not be involved in, that have to do with logistics and hotels and convention center and security and all sorts of things like that. But I think a lot of people that I've dealt with over the years associate me with Comic-Con just because I was the person they dealt with when I was handling the pro registration or the guest relations. So they think of, oh, I need something from Comic-Con, I'll call Jackie. So I think that's kind of a perception that's out there, but I have my parts of the show I do, and everybody else has their parts of the show they do, and most of the people have been in their jobs for a really long time. The president of Comic-Con, John Rogers, I think has been president since '85. Most of the board members have been on the board for at least 10 years. A lot of the department of heads have been around since the '80s or even earlier. So there's a lot of continuity involved in the show. I was very delighted to be asked by Mike Towery to be a guest for the Comics Fest in October. It's great to be invited to be at a show where I don't have to do any work. I just have to show up and be, on panels and things. And it's the first time I've ever been a guest at anything, so I'm really looking forward to it, because it's going to be a small scale event where people who, even if we're all at Comic-Con, may not see each other the whole time, or may see each other for 5 minutes. So this will be a location where we can all just get together and talk about the olden days and what it was like to just be hanging around and hobnobbing with some of the greats of comics and science fiction that, who knew years later that, everybody in America would know who they are and be, wow, you knew him, you knew her. Yeah, we used to hang around the pool, we had dinner together, wow. So, where do I see Comic-Con going in the future is, I like the idea of it pretty much expanding beyond the convention center and just taking over all of San Diego. It's already pretty much taking over downtown, because other companies and organizations and people are doing events all over downtown during Comic-Con. There are art shows, there are charity events. This year they're doing the Walking Dead experience at Petco Park. There are restaurants that have been turned into things like the Star Wars Lounge. So even if somebody doesn't have a pass or a ticket to go to Comic-Con, they can just go downtown and find a million things to do that are comics related. There's restaurants that are offering discounts if you come in wearing a costume. It's definitely a model that's been used in European comics festivals, where they take over the whole city and it just becomes one big festival for everybody. And our mission has been, and we have a mission statement, to promote the comic arts and related popular arts through putting on events. And now people, you say the word Comic-Con, people think San Diego. You say San Diego, people think Comic-Con. And no matter how many other kinds of things are at the show beside comics, comics are the focus that people think of when they think of the show. Well, one of the things that has been a benefit of San Diego as a site for a comic convention is that our facilities are all so concentrated in one area. The airport's right by downtown, the convention center, you walk out the door and there are hotels and there are restaurants and a gas lamp. If you go to other cities, say New York or Chicago, their convention centers are off to an area that you need transportation just to get to the convention center, and then when you get out and want to go to dinner, then you have to get a cab or somehow take shuttle buses or whatever. Everything's concentrated here. The other thing is that in the summer in San Diego, the weather is mild and everybody else in the country is really hot. So they love to come to San Diego. People keep saying, well, why don't conventions in Los Angeles do well? Why shouldn't there be a Comic-Con in LA? Wouldn't all the Hollywood people go there and that would be just awesome? It's like the Hollywood people don't want to be in LA. The Hollywood people want to come to San Diego. They find it, a delightful place to come, and this is, a thing that they jump at the chance. Oh, come on! I want to do a movie that will be premiering in a time that I'll have to go to San Diego to promote it. It's not a drag for them to do it. They love to do it, and a lot of celebrities are kind of closet fans, and they will put on a disguise and go around the hall and buy things and see things just to be fans themselves. As far as it being a hotbed of fan community or of comics publishing or anything, it was never a publishing hub, although we now do have IDW here. It was never really a comic shop rich town. We've had our comic shops, but none of them are, ones that have become famous. We did have Comic Kingdom for a while, which of course Richard Elf started, and that Jack Dickens owned for many years, and that was a place where several people ended up being professionals in comics, were clerks there at some point in their life. But you would think that with Comic-Con here that there would be comic shops galore and they would have all kinds of events and signings and things going on, but that's not the case. We don't really have a huge number of cartoonists here. My husband's one of them. Bat and Lash does the comic Supernatural Law, so at the convention itself, I'm actually wearing my other hat too as an exhibitor, because we publish his books and comics. And he is an artist that's got his own studio, and he works with other artists in San Diego, but it's a community where when somebody has a Christmas party and you get 30 or 40 people there, that's everybody in comics in San Diego that's working as professional cartoonists. I've gone to panels at Comic-Con where the guys on the stage will say, I used to come here when I was a teenager, and I always thought, well, someday I'm going to make a movie and be up on the stage at Comic-Con. And I think there's just a generation of fans that grew up and became the big hot guys in Hollywood, and think it's like, I'm gonna somehow have my program at Comic-Con. I'm gonna go to Comic-Con, and that's been a factor. In addition to just smart publishers and other companies saying, if I've got a project that's going to have these fans as my target, I have to be there. And I have to compete with all the other people doing projects and make a splash. So I'm going to bring in Leonard Nimoy for my thing, or I'm going to bring in Francis Ford Coppola, or I'm going to bring in Arnold Schwarzenegger, or whatever it is to have the attention come my direction. So that's the kind of element that has contributed to it getting bigger, that's for sure. One of the things that people have asked me is, well, what was it about those early 70s conventions that made you want to get involved? And I would say just the nicest people. The nicest people.